Aidan, welcome to Mint Season 7. Thank you for being on. How you doing?
Hey Adam, I'm doing good. Super excited and good to be here and looking forward to discussing a bunch of interesting stuff related to season 7 and where you're getting curious about and want to share about.
I think Spinamp fits exactly where my curiosity lies, which is hence why you're part of the lineup, a part of the season as a whole. The whole entire theme is creating content worth collecting. And Spinamp plays an important role in that entire layer, the consumption layer. As I've been talking about on the podcast for a minute now, I feel like since February, when I did my season 4 all in music NFTs, one of the biggest discussions was like, okay, what is the consumption layer for all the music that we're collecting? And lo and behold, Spinamp and a few others are building that, right? So, Aidan, before we jump into Spinamp in this entire topic, I want to start with you as a founder, as an entrepreneur, building in Web3. What's your story? How did you get into crypto? Let alone why the founder path in general?
Yeah, so sure. So my background's originally more on the technical side, doing maths, computer science, distributed systems. I spent a few years working in like traditional Web2 distributed systems, um, and then consulted and freelanced for like many years across different technologies, different industries, different stacks. And I think, I got into crypto originally, must have been like 6 or 7 years ago. At the time, I was kind of like fed up and bored of kind of the traditional work that I'd been doing in Web2 and in like traditional full stack kind of software engineering and product work. And so I decided to like take some time off, explore new technologies and areas. And even back then, like I'd always wanted to make the time to dig into Ethereum and Bitcoin more. Eventually got around to it and started digging in. Um, Ended up meeting a whole bunch of cool people in the space, coming a lot of cool projects in the space, and so slowly shifted to spending my attention and time on projects related to Ethereum. And that was again like 6 years ago. Since then, I think it's grown to consume most of the work that I do. And the first few years I continued along that like consultant freelancer path that I was doing, but in more recent years, as additionally I've like wanted to transition into working more on my own projects, my own ideas, and things that I find exciting. The opportunity to do that from like a founder perspective, I think brings a lot more potential for like fulfillment and for like creative control and influence on like the way you're spending your time. And so I think that's been a collection of the factors that have led me to where I am now.
Got it. So where does Spinamp come into the picture?
Yeah, so Spinamp started probably about 7, 8 months ago. Before Spinamp, myself and my team had been working on another music NFT related project, which was a way for us to like dip our toes into the water for the space. And it was a fun project to be working on, but um, it was it wasn't something that I'd founded myself. It was like a project we were helping out a friend with, and it at the time we didn't really manage to find the right like market product fit. So this project was called Noised. It's a music NFT marketplace focused on African music, and it's still live. It's still got a lot of cool content and music on there, but the artists and the community there is like quite disconnected from Web3, to some extent even disconnected from like Twitter and the internet and all these like social systems that Web3 revolves around. And so um, the idea of like collecting music was a lot harder to form a connection with for the like community of the musicians and the content that we were um, using to create music NFTs, as opposed to the stuff that we're seeing start to take off in the last year or two. And I think a part of that, influenced Spinamp in the sense of wanting to build something that actually brings the like listener and fan experience into collecting, and the act of consuming content closer to the act of collecting. Um, as well as at the time, I was working on that project from a technical perspective. I wasn't really that familiar with the artists themselves, and I found like I'm helping build this thing that I don't even know like that much about the artists and their music, and I wasn't listening to their music that much. And so for me, I wanted an app that I could actually start using to start paying attention to and listening to these artists. And so Spinamp was born out of like that personal need that I had at the time and so we launched it, with I think 3 or 4 platforms initially: Sound, Catalog, Noise, and one other. Um, to solve that problem of like being able to just easily listen to the music in your day-to-day life. And over the last 6 months, we've like grown and evolved it into essentially becoming this core consumption layer for Web3 music and music NFTs, a place to like discover music, a place to discover new artists and their drops. And recently we just released a feature that allows you to actually collect directly on Spinamp and bring that like collection and consumption experience closer and closer together, and make it like as seamless as we can.
Let me take the back seat for a moment from someone who doesn't understand the space. Okay. Are you just building another streaming service, like a deconstructed streaming service, or what's the vision here?
Yeah, so I think like a key component of the vision is this idea that like collecting music NFTs is a different kind of experience to just streaming or listening to music. There's, we can dig into all the different reasons why people collect and like what's worth collecting or not, but the core of it is that like it's quite a different experience, and there's a lot of different reasons why people would do that as opposed to just pure streaming. And so a part of this thesis is that additionally, as part of this collecting experience, consuming content and engaging with the music, listening to the music and enjoying it is going to amplify your collecting experience, and in some ways even lead your collecting experience. Like we released Spinamp Collect a week ago, and like one of the key aspects of that is we really want Spinamp to continue to be like a listener focused app, music focused, putting the content and the music first, but also driven under the thesis that content will encourage and entice people into collecting, and that like collecting can follow listening. And like it's a little bit of a different experience to both say on Spotify, where it's great for streaming music and for experiencing it, but it doesn't have that same like direct access connection into the collection process and into that engagement directly with the artist and their content and their story. Whereas say OpenSea, it's good for collecting stuff, but it's not grounded in that like consumptive experience and the actual like enjoyment of the content. And so if you look at the user base of people collecting and trading on OpenSea, a lot of the time they can be like quite disconnected from the content, and we feel like in order to create like the most ideal experience, finding a way to have consumption and collection really go hand in hand and like be in a symbiotic experience together, where they both encourage and support each other through the user's actions and experiences, is how we imagine like the ideal music NFT experience to look.
From an outsider's perspective, the biggest differentiator that I see is Spotify's missing commerce. Like that's what it really kind of comes down to. And with Spinamp, not only do you guys aggregate all the music or a lot of the music on chain in a very nice, intuitive manner, but now recently, as of last week, you can now collect that music as well or put offers on that music. So if you enjoy a song and you feel some type of emotional connection to it, or you believe in the artist or whatever your reason may be, you can actually execute a purchase with that, a collect with that, and tap into that artist community, right? And it starts with music, but where does it go from there? What other forms of content do you imagine aggregating and putting a focus on?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Spinamp always started with music being the focus, and it will continue to be so. But once there's easier ways in which we can add other forms of content to the app. So, like the easiest low-hanging fruit there is, of course, podcasts. It's also audio content. We've seen Spotify do it. They may be separated into a separate section, so it's easier for people to navigate how they want to do either. Maybe they lead people into discovering new podcasts as part of their listening experience. But it's a fairly straightforward thing to think of how that could fit into the context of Spinamp and a listening app. It's still quite a different experience. And so when we think about like content worth collecting, and like why would people collect podcasts versus collecting music, and are these like different user types and people with different intentions, it's certainly the case that there's a lot of overlap, but there's also a lot of separation. And so I think the finding the place for that to fit into the experience is something we will want to experiment with, but I imagine there's still a place for that. I think the other one that's easier to imagine fitting in is like music videos, where again, it's still, within the same domain, it's potentially even the same artists and the same kind of producers of content. And so especially if you're collecting as a way of engaging with not just like the particular track, but the whole artist's artwork and their story and narrative around it, their music video is almost likely going to be a big part of that as well. And similarly, listening to and watching music and videos can kind of fairly seamlessly fit into the experience of Spinamp. And so I think that's kind of the areas that we're imagining potentially evolving to in the like medium term. I'd say longer term, like all our tech infrastructure and such is like built in a way where we could support other kinds of content, whether that's like other kinds of audiovisual content, written content, interactive content, but it's not really something we're thinking too much about at this point in time. I think in order, like we are trying to stay focused on music and potentially other audio content as the primary drivers of what Spinamp is for. And if we start to extend into other content types, I think they will still be grounded in the idea of like a music listening out. Maybe an artist wants to post their lyrics on the page, or is doing a blog and is speaking about their music, and it still fits into the context of showing the artist profile. But I would say it's still something that's much more longer term than where we're at today.
How do you envision the consumption layer in Web 2 differing than that of Web 3? We kind of identified the biggest one, collecting, but is there anything else that the Spotify's and the Apple Musics of the world are missing that you could probably potentially fix through Web 3?
Yeah, I mean, I think another aspect of Web 3 that stands out, or maybe like the two biggest one that stand out to me, is one is the social aspect of Web 3, and two is the composability aspect of Web 3. So to dig into each of them, the social aspect, well, a lot of Web 3 is about like finance, it's about NFTs, it's about these like financial objects that people are engaging with, trading, transferring to each other. And like finance and money itself is a social technology. Like money was invented and evolved because of the ways in which it allows people to socially coordinate with each other. And that aspect of the like social activity is something that's definitely missing from major music streaming platforms, whether it's Apple Music, Spotify. We have seen a lot of cool experiments with that in Web 2, whether it's like SoundCloud or Last.fm or like some of the other more weirder social music experiments. But the fact that they haven't really seemed to have taken off in the context of like the bigger streaming app winners is interesting, and it feels like an area that is still ripe for experimentation, and especially in the context of Web3, where the collection itself is completely entwined with the social landscape. It's, I think, it hopefully will provide a fertile ground for building out social experiences where maybe they haven't fit that easily into a platform like Spotify due to the way in which people experience that app. The second one that I mentioned is composability, is this idea that in Web3, so much of what people release is public, whether it's an open source indexer or smart contract on chain or stored on the blockchain. The data and the applications are public, and anyone can integrate with them and build stuff on top of them. And so, like even Spinamp today is built on that, in the sense that Spinamp aggregates content that's already on chain that other platforms have been, working with. And we feel like that aspect of Web3 also just opens up a fertile ground for experimentation, both within our team, also within other teams in the ecosystem, and with the tools and open source systems that we release and infrastructure that we release. The ability to experiment through composability feels like it's something that could lead to a lot of innovation that we haven't been able to see with these like more closed APIs in the Web2 streaming world.
Any innovations that you're incredibly excited about, more specifically, that we haven't maybe seen kind of like prevail publicly in different use cases yet?
Let me think. I'd say like the social aspects to NFTs are ones we've seen like scattered experiences around, whether it's like NFT holders banding together to set up a snapshot or a Discord group or a Telegram, whether it's like even like Lens is an example where they've got a fairly cohesive social platform, but it's still very like generic interfaces that have been built for it that are not tailored to particular social experiences. I think seeing how these building blocks that are now in place get built on top of and start to evolve could be exciting in terms of how we unlock, like, one of the core propositions that we've seen in like traditional profile picture styles and NFTs is how, and things like NounsDAO, is how they managed to grow like a social community around them and a community that's both socially engages, but also like takes action together, makes proposals together, votes on things together, spends money together. And so, seeing how those products and experiences can mature over the coming year, I think will be super exciting.
Yeah. Something that I think about often is trying to understand what types of content will succeed in the traditional Web3 format. Content in Web3 is underpinned by capital. So when I think about like what other forms of content are next to take off, PFPs and different variations of profile pictures, right? To photography, to digital art, AR, VR, even digital property like land, film, fashion. What do you think is restricting other forms of content from taking off?
Yeah, I think to dig into that, it's probably worth digging into like your term content worth collecting, and so like what does it mean for something to be worth collecting? And I think like that really comes down to like what value do people get from collecting it, and why do they collect it? And I think we've seen, at least in the context of music NFTs, there's many different reasons. There's like the kind of patron style user who's they really love artists, they want to support them, they want to give them their money so they can keep producing their art and keep producing their content. There's like the speculator. The speculator is there to potentially buy something, resell it later, make a profit. There's the like everyday fan. Maybe they're buying the NFT because the NFT gives them some perks or some like private chat with the artist, and they can like simp for the artist. You get like the community aspect of it where maybe the fans are buying the NFTs not necessarily to connect and have a relationship with the artist directly, but to have a relationship with other fans in the same community as the artist, and like that subculture. And you get all the aspects of social signaling that you see in like the high art world and like the entertainment industry, where people are buying NFTs as part of like social signaling, and those are all like very different use cases. There's definitely a blur and overlap across all of them, but they are all the kinds of things that bring value to NFTs and like make them worth collecting. And so back to content worth collecting, how does that tie directly into content? I think it's like it's harder to ascribe those things to the medium of the content, whether it's like video or audio or interactive media. The things that we mentioned, or that I mentioned in the last topic around like what makes something worth collecting, are somewhat like independent of the media, and a lot of them are related to like the context around the media. And so, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think those are like some interesting nuances to use as a starting point for how to think about
Right.
answering that question. But yeah, I'd love to get your like response to that like perspective.
I think it's like such a redundant answer, but I think education and onboarding is restricting other forms of content from taking off. There's a specific subgroup of collectors that appreciate and enjoy collecting a specific type of content, music being one of them, or digital art being one of them. We're seeing other forms of content arise, but they haven't picked up as much traction just yet. Video NFTs, photography NFTs. Um, we see fashion starting to take off more and more and more. I've been covering fashion since like 2019, I feel like. And the same people are still pushing the needle, but you're seeing new creatives enter the space with new concepts and whatnot. But it still seems as if music and digital art still have captured like the largest market so far, right? And when I think about the types of creators that exist in the world today and the biggest platforms that support specific types of creators, for example, like short form content, all the creators on TikTok that create content for a living and try to tap into the algorithms to build followers, right? In a viral setting, like that's a whole new market to tap into, short form content that's worth collecting, right? I think the most kind of like prevalent example is looking at memes that get virality and get a lot of views and a lot of attention have become one with culture, right? The memes of culture, those are probably worth collecting as well, but there aren't markets for that. Like the markets aren't yet completely ascribed just yet, right? So I'm trying to think
Yeah,
about like it comes down to education, onboarding. Maybe it comes down to more like successful case studies, right? I'd argue that seeing Daniel Allen kind of like take off in the music space has motivated a lot of other musicians to enter the space. Seeing what he did in 48 hours, right, opened up the minds and creativity for many labels, many independent artists, and everything in between. So, kind of getting more of these case studies out there of like a successful short form content creator and a successful podcaster and a successful videographer and a successful cook, right? Like a chef that wants to create a cookbook and wants to sell ebooks via NFTs, right? I think it's documenting that through education and then providing the right pipelines for onboarding that could stimulate
No, totally, totally. And
more
then if you
growth.
look at like the way that growth often happens, it comes from people replicating things that they've seen work elsewhere. Whether it's the different models we saw with profile picture NFTs and art NFTs mapping over to music NFTs, and people experimenting with similar models around one of ones versus multi-print editions, to people replicating the successes of people that of other artists that are doing similar things to them. I think sometimes that replication works, and like a model that's proven to work in one context or in one form of media does map over to another. But other times we need to find like tweaks on the structure of the release and the NFT that's maybe more suited to the kind of content being released. And I think that I still feel like the place to be looking in order to find the evolutions to how releases should look like for new forms of content and for new mediums. We should be looking at those like underlying value propositions and like reasons why people collect and like why people get value out of collecting to help
Right.
us find like what needs to evolve as we kind of spread to new mediums and new kinds of content and new relationships between collectors and their NFT base.
I also often think about like who was the original content creator in crypto? And it was the journalists, the writers, right? The ones who would document the space and share thoughts across subreddits or whatever those forums were at the time. And if you look at the market for like writing NFTs, for example, they're not as hot as music, right? Even though I feel like I read more online than I do listen, I don't know what it would really entail for me to collect a writing NFT, let alone pay for it. I see the fun of collecting a free writing NFT to show you were there. Like Dennis says this for me. He's like, if you didn't read something or if you didn't collect something, did you even read it? He says a variation of that. I'm paraphrasing. And it makes me think like showing your support and showing your patronage by collecting something, even if it's free, right? That's content worth collecting, but is it content worth paying for? So when I think about the original creator, I think about the writer. I then think about the artist. I think about all the artists that use music to sell their digital art and how that introduced music into the picture. And yeah, I don't know. I also have like this internal debate of like what's worth kind of giving out for free and then what's worth charging for. And there's this big, I guess, stigma in NFTs around drop culture, right? Like you have to have like this big PR moment, you have to do your threads, you have to do all this like PR marketing and prep in order to sell out like a big campaign for the most part, right? And I'm trying to think like, is that a new form of publishing and I guess preparation for a different type of content, right? Like whereas in TikTok you just publish something and then you let the algorithms do their thing, versus in
Mm-hmm.
Web3 right now it's very much like you hustling and being your solopreneur, trying to sell something out. So
Yeah,
I
and
don't know.
then I would
You
love
can
to
see
see
my
more of.
thoughts are just like all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see like that idea of kind of longer term growth in collecting happening as opposed to all being there at the point of the drop, and especially like um, it depends on the kind of content itself because some content is best consumed like longer term. Like I think I remember reading a quote by Vitalik a few weeks ago or months ago, maybe it was years ago now. But it's a good point around specifically writing and um, like blog posts and long form content. Often, if you look at the majority of content that people consume, it's like more recent. It's more like newsy. It's more about like recent activity. But if you look at the highest quality content that's the most impactful, it's often content that's had months or years to kind of simmer and to get curated and to like sustain itself. And things like long form books that people have written or just like articles that people keep coming back to a year or two later that are like the most impactful. And like that feels incompatible with the ways in which we're currently releasing NFTs today. Um,
Yeah.
and so back to the like previous conversation we were having around like, okay, how do these models of NFTs need to evolve and change in order to facilitate the ways, like different kinds of content, and to be more aligned with the ways in which like that content is actually consumed, feels like important. And like, in the context of music NFTs, even with music, we see there's a difference between, say, pop music that charts and is popular for a few weeks and gets a ton of plays, but then fades away, as opposed to like albums that artists spend like 6 months putting their time into and then releasing, and that becomes like this piece of work that embodies them for like a long term and for like the rest of their discography.
Right.
And so similar, and that's something I think I've been also like a little bit torn on, in the sense that like most of the content on Spinamp today is individual tracks and individual releases that maybe get the most attention only at that point of release, but don't have that same kind of longer term retention that you would get from like an album on Spotify, or a book
sense.
or a novel or an article that is on the Atlantic that people referenced 10 years ago.
Makes sense. I want to bring up another example and just have a quick dialogue on it. While he may be controversial in the current times, but Logan Paul, in my opinion, killed it with 99 Originals. Are you familiar with that project?
I've seen it like here and there on Twitter. To be honest, I haven't like dug into exactly what it's doing and like how it works, but besides glimpses.
So it was the first project that I saw that resonated and got respect both from the Web2 audience and from the Web3 audience. And it took a Nouns DAO approach to kind of like selling or auctioning content. And he basically took 99 Polaroids across 99 different experiences and really perfected the element of storytelling around these pieces and sold each JPEG, essentially each Polaroid. Some had additional perks, others didn't have additional perks, but sold each one for tons and tons and tons of money. Grossed, I think, a few $100,000, if not $1 million. I could be mistaken. Don't mark my word on the number. But I remember it was a mass success. And I remember at the time when he was producing that content and publishing it on TikTok and Instagram, whatever, he got such supportive comments from his traditional fans because he was like, wow, Logan is actually like an artiste. Like, he really gets the creative journey and he's an incredible storyteller. And then in Web3, you had that wow factor of it just being Logan Paul, but also the storytelling element of content that was worth collecting, and it had this significance and this historical significance to it that, wow, he went on this entire journey, documented his entire process step by step, and was able to auction every single one of those moments for God knows how much in ETH, right? So when I think about like content worth collecting, and I wrote this on Friday, it's like content worth collecting requires a deep understanding of your audience and what motivates them, right? It's that ability to connect with people on a deeper level, to understand their needs or desires, and to create that content that speaks to them in a way that is meaningful and authentic. Like, that's what I think about, right? And that may trigger someone to either just press the collect button, and whether it's a paid collect or a free collect, but it's content worth collecting, a little bit of a tangent.
Totally.
That's what I
No, and
really
I think
believe
that's a good
that.
example. And like, even you mentioned the Nouns model as being like a potential source or inspiration from that, and that's an interesting one because we've seen the like longer term kind of rollout of Nouns, and they seem to have still sustainably continued to get sales week by week and month by month, and so it's a great experiment to prove like longer term models of releases, whether it's in the context of a DAO, in the context of an NFT, are ones that like could potentially work. And so that also, I'd love to see, like, I know Zora released their like Nouns builder a few weeks ago. I'd be curious to see how that could be applied to content that is best consumed on like a longer form basis, whether it's those mechanisms or further composed experiments on top of those mechanisms that are tailored to different types of content.
I want to jump more into Spinamp and understand the mechanics of Spinamp. Okay. If I read correctly, when you create a playlist on Spinamp, you actually mint that playlist, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
That is an idea we've been toying with around minting playlists on chain, but at the moment playlists are off chain. They are decentralized. They're stored on like a decentralized infrastructure indexer, but it's still off chain, and they're not NFTs. I think that we've had a bunch of conversations around building like protocols on chain for curating content, and there are already some protocols on chain for curating content, and putting Spinamp playlists on chain would be a form of that. But I think because we're still at the stage of experimenting with like the underlying NFTs, it's unclear whether it's like the right design for curating stuff on chain. I think the other aspect of it is like the experience that we wanted to create with Spinamp is one where you can easily go and curate your collection, create playlists, add stuff to favorites, change stuff around, and modify and share your collection without having to do transactions, without having to pay anything. And so in order to have like the UX to facilitate that, we didn't want it to need to go on chain just yet. But yeah, that is something like, I think on-chain curation is certainly like an open question, and like to see how the current and upcoming experiments play out with that will be super exciting.
It almost feels like, Aidan, that every interaction should be some form of collect. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. So when I like a video on TikTok and that ends up in my saved folder, right, that I can then review, it's very analogous to collecting something and then it ending up in my wallet, right? Or when I save a song on Spotify and then it getting curated to my master playlist, right? It's very analogous again to collecting something and it getting into your wallet. So I feel like as an end user, when you create a playlist for yourself personally to consume whatever content or music you want, I wonder if those interactions make sense to be minted, a free mint, right? So that you understand more of the user's preferences, and I don't know, maybe even the artist can use that information in a creative way to understand who his top listeners, his top collectors are, his top engagers are. You know what I mean?
No, I totally agree. I think every interaction is really like something like a collect. And even if you look at Spinamp today, like the stuff that you favorite and add to playlists, we put into your library, and it's almost like it is kind of like your collection. We use the term library, but it's a similar term. I think that's a separate question to like, where should that collect live? Should it be an NFT? Should it be on chain? Should it be off chain? Who should get to see it? Should the other fans get to see it? Should the artists get to see it? Those are all like individual separate questions that I think you need to ask separately to whether it's like a collect and whether that engagement is something like collecting. And I don't know if the answer to all of those questions is that it should just be an NFT on chain. But I definitely think from like the user experience perspective and from the person that's going and making these interactions from their perspective, like that is certainly part of the collecting experience. And every interaction you make is like a way of you engaging and collecting that content.
Got it. What about the multiplayer experience? Do you imagine or do you envision any form of multiplayer abilities with consuming content collectively amongst a group of collectors? Is that even a thing worth exploring? Maybe I'm throwing shit at the fan here, but a new idea that popped up right now.
No, we've actually been thinking about that a lot. Like, I don't know if you saw, like PartyDAO released
Right.
their product a few weeks ago around like party bids and party collecting, and they did a few things before, and there were already some music NFTs like a few months ago that people formed little parties to collect. It definitely feels like there's a lot of like untapped fun in those kinds of experiences, whether it's through the stuff we've already seen around like fractionalizing an NFT that's been collected, or whether it's through like micro DAOs and like spontaneous DAOs that are formed for the purposes of collecting and curating. Even Spinamp playlists, we wanted to, we've been thinking about adding support for like a Gnosis safe DAO to be able to kind of do Spinamp playlists and share them. And so I think as soon as part of like the social evolution of like music NFT collecting, allowing groups to exist and take social actions together, whatever those actions may be, is definitely like a kind of thing I'd love to see happen. And maybe our team will release something along those lines in time. But I think there's a ton of potential around that area in the space in general.
Yeah. I look at Spinamp in its current form, and I look at you as a founder. And something that I think about as a podcaster is like, what are the links between the founder's DNA and how they're wired to what they're building? And I want to understand, considering where Spinamp is today, the product that you have, both iOS and the web app, what excites you that you haven't yet executed on for Spinamp? Like, what are we not seeing in the mind of Aidan that has yet to be kind of prevailed in the world of Web3 consumption, right? That you'd either want to tag along into Spinamp's product flow or new ideas that you're thinking about, new philosophies. Where does that lie?
Yeah, I think I think the social aspect is definitely one aspect there, in the sense of further differentiating what we're doing from traditional streaming apps, and like really honing in on what Web3 brings that's different. I think looking to see what kind of interesting social features we can build is a part of that, and specifically, I think ideas around what we can do on chain that is like involves stretching the models for how people are collecting. Whether and like the fractionalization example is like a already existing example of that, but I think there's a wide design space for how we can build new kind of structures for people to engage with NFTs, engage with collecting, and engage with each other on chain. And starting to experiment with and explore some of those, I think would be like something that I find exciting and like technically challenging, and there's a lot of like innovative potential too. I think one thing we've been thinking about a bunch is trading NFTs, being able to swap them with each other, like trading card game style, and how that fits with the content at hand and music and like what that means for if we think about how NFT marketplaces work, especially say like OpenSea and the majority of them today, they there's often a disconnect between the participants that are trading with each other on the marketplace, and finding ways to kind of grow that connection and help like trading be an act of like an actual engagement with another collector. Is that I'd say that's like a collection of some of the things we're thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
There's some other ones that I think they're still like bubbling and like getting refined.
Okay. All right, fair.
But yeah, those are some that are certainly on our mind as a team and excite me in their potential.
So in this response that you just gave me, you talked about enjoying the technical challenges that came with building Spinamp. Can you walk me through more of what challenges you faced while producing the initial version of the product? And I also want to know, how did you land on that sort of design style for Spinamp? It's very edgy. It's very different than what you typically get from a traditional media player that maybe we use on a daily basis.
Yeah, so maybe I'll go with the design side first. I think like
Okay.
one of the things in the name, there's Spinamp, which rhymes with Winamp. There was this music player app a decade or two ago, which I suppose still exists today, but it's no longer as popular, called Winamp, and like it had this like older school retro style. I think that was a part of the design inspiration. There's like, I don't know if you're familiar with like Poolside. They launched initially as just like a little music radio app, and they had like square kind of retro style design, and like we had a bit of inspiration from there. And I think in general, like the design comes from I think when we initially built SpinUp, we used this like templates of like how to build a like template like mobile app thing, and like that had like a very generic hackery technical style design where it was straightforward, like squares and lines, and I think that a lot of it was like intentional in the sense of like, okay, we kind of like the style and wanted to kind of get inspired from it and these different sources, but a lot of it was incidental in the sense that we just wanted to like build stuff and work on improving and evolving the aesthetic in time. And I think that's still true today, where we'll certainly continue to evolve the aesthetic and design. And you've probably seen a bunch of that with like themes, which are not like that crazy in the sense mostly like colors and skins and things, but evolving the design in kind of other ways to suit different artists and different users over time, I think is something that's naturally going to happen. Back to your technical question, is like what have been some of the interesting challenges? I think one thing with Spinamp that we really like stuck to is ensuring that like all the infrastructure we build can continue to be aligned with the Web3 culture. And so what does that mean? That means that our infrastructure either lives on chain, or if it lives off chain, it can be open source and it can be run by anyone, and it can be run in like a peer-to-peer network. And so, if you look at IPFS as an example of that, which most people in the NFT scene are aware of, IPFS it's not on chain, it's an off-chain peer-to-peer network where people share content, and that content automatically gets distributed to a decentralized group of nodes. And you've got the like two, I'd say like extreme size. IPFS is an example where it's just pure content. There's no real like computation or logic, and so you don't really need complex kind of consensus algorithms, and so you don't need a blockchain. And then you've got the other extreme where it's like a layer one blockchain where there's a double spend problem. It's like a financial ledger, and you need a consensus, and you need that. And within that consensus, you need everyone in the world to agree on that consensus, and to agree on an order of transactions. And so now Spinamp lives somewhere in the middle where we still need consensus. Take the example of an artist going and updating their name or updating their profile picture. That's data that can change. There is some computation there, and that they need to be able to update their profile picture to a new one. Another example would be say we want to show a summary of how many drops has this artist done. 6 drops. So you need to add up all their drops, and there's a little addition computation that happens there. And so we still kind of require computation, we require consensus there, but we don't want to be a blockchain. We don't want to have a full BFT consensus algorithm. But on the other hand, we don't want to be a dumb kind of storage layer or a centralized system. And so one of the goals that we've kind of stuck to in our design for architecture is how can we find consensus for these kinds of simpler computations without requiring a blockchain and without requiring traditional Web3 system. Because as soon as you introduce a blockchain, you've got a lot of other complications that come to mind, whether it's scaling or token related considerations, whatever it is. And so the main tool we use to do this is, on the technical side, it's called a CRDT, and it's essentially an algorithm that says if everyone runs this algorithm, everyone's going to get to the same answer. If we take addition as the example, if you see 6 drops, I see 6 drops, we know we just add them up and we both get to the number 6. It's a very simple formula. Just add up all the drops and then get the total. And so for me and you to agree on how many drops has an artist made, we both just need to know how to add in the same way, and we also need to see. We actually have to have seen the drops to know, but we don't need to run this complex back and forth consensus to determine, hey, do you agree about this or do you disagree about this? It's we have a single source of truth of if we've seen a drop, then we know it's true and we know how to add. And so it's a different style of consensus that doesn't require blockchain, but that does impose constraints on how we build our index, how we build our architecture. And it's been an interesting challenge that's guided a lot of the technical implementation of what we do.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. On the topic of product, okay, I want to pick your brain on recommendation algorithms. When you use Spotify and Apple Music, not only do they recommend you playlists, but as you consume and you listen to new songs, they recommend you individual songs to kind of enjoy as well, right? So the biggest differentiator in terms of behavior is you don't just consume in Web3, you also collect. How do you think about recommendation algorithms from the sense of consumption and also collection? Where does that come into the picture?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think the answer ties into our previous topic around why do people collect and what value do people get out of collecting. And again, you've got these different users that are trying to get different things. If you're thinking about a speculator, in order to give them a recommendation, the only thing you can recommend to them that's going to satisfy them is something that makes them a profit. And to give that kind of recommendation is also a very risky one, because to claim that something's going to be profitable or not is a claim that only it's again something that you have to predict, that you can't necessarily be sure about. If you look at, say, someone that's looking to support artists as a patron, then there's the things that they would want to see is maybe someone that's up and coming, someone that's got a rags to riches story, someone that maybe just they resonate with and they actually like the content. And so recommendation there, I think, happens along different set of dimensions. If you look at a fan that wants to find a community and connect with a subculture, then maybe they're interested in who the other collectors are, what are their interests, what other music NFTs do they collect, what kind of activities do they have, a shared Discord, do they have a Telegram, do they have a social scene, and so because we've got these different dimensions of why people collect, I think the kind of automated algorithmic single one-size-fits-all recommendation algorithm that you see in Apple and Spotify and these platforms is not really ideal, at least for Spinamp where it is today, where it's kind of covering a murky mess of all of these kinds of NFT use cases. And so it means we have to be quite careful about collecting. And I think anything that we do, about recommendation, and I think anything we do release around recommendation will have to tie into stuff that's either directly personalized to to the user based on their interest and their desires and what they want to be recommended, or directly coming from like ground truth, like on-chain data around like, hey, this is exactly what happened on chain, and we can relate like this on-chain data to one of those desires that you may have around why you're collecting.
Got it. I want to sort of like end the conversation with approaching you and asking for your, I guess, your open dialogue on some of the music aggregator debate that happened about a couple weeks ago. So, Aidan, when an artist comes to you and they're like, "Why should Spinamp be allowed to aggregate my music for free," and then give that to their fans or to the platform's listeners, and I make nothing off the listenership, right? I don't get that sort of like revenue that I would traditionally get. Let alone why should you even be allowed to take my music or aggregate my music? How do you respond to that? What are your thoughts around this entire debate?
Yeah, no, great question. I think there's a few aspects to this debate. I'd say like the one kind of key point for me is I think like what's happening with music NFTs is very much an experiment today, and we're experimenting essentially with are there new ways of valuing music, new ways of economic models emerging around music, um, and so in order for those to succeed, we need to be able to experiment, um, and so we do need content to experiment with, and so this whole experiment of like Web3 music couldn't really exist without at least some artists making their music available. The second aspect of it is the kind of ethos of Web3. I think certainly a lot of artists, they sign contracts with specific platforms like Sound and Catalog and so on to kind of share their content there. But if their content is locked on those platforms, then it kind of doesn't really form part of this Web3 experiment if it can't actually be something that's like more accessed and composed. And so we're not really like doing the experiment justice unless we do it properly. And we risk, just building the same kind of Web2 style centralized systems in that way. And I think on a more practical level, I think the purpose of the experiment is to get artists more funding and get them more money. And so the like more practical answer is that really by having their content open, by allowing aggregators to aggregate and share their content, actually they're going to get more money than if they don't do that. And like that's obviously like a claim that we're making. It's a claim that we need to prove. I can say today for Spinamp, like that's already true. And the content that people have collected through Spinamp has already got artists more money than they would have in traditional platforms, relatively. And so and I think like the bigger part of that is that the whole thesis around collecting is that like people are going to collect and give money to artists more likely in a stronger way if they've actually experienced the content and they've gotten access to the content first, and their experience consuming the content has actually led to them wanting to collect and fund the artists. And so the like last piece of this is especially for Spinamp, one in which we believe that having access to the content and allowing people to consume and listen to it will actually essentially lead to more collecting and more money going to artists. And so it's actually in the artist's best interest for listeners to be actually consuming their content as part of a cohesive collection experience instead of just going to like a kind of financial marketplace to like buy their content, which is kind of disconnected from the relationship that they're building with their fans, and that like closer relationship through their content actually, we hope will lead to actually more like financial success for artists than otherwise.
I do see a world where being able to accrue revenue through secondaries with traffic driven because of Spinamp to those applications or to those NFTs will ultimately lead, hopefully at scale, to a more, I guess, beneficial model for a lot of music artists, at least independent ones. But I also see a world where there could be a challenge of music aggregators getting attacked by traditional legal reforms and whatever that may look like to kind of like recognize the traditional manner and then apply that and tack that on to sort of this new school manner of engagement and consumption. What other ways of monetization do you imagine a Spinamp enabling in the future?
Yeah, so I think like one kind of guideline and motivation that we have is like Spinamp is there to support the space and to support artists in the space. And so when it comes to monetization, I think any monetization that Spinamp has will tie directly to us succeeding at bringing artists more money themselves. And so like that's, the thing that we released last week, being able to collect on Spinamp. We're not currently monetizing that, but it is, of course, like financial flow that's happening through our app. And but the nice thing about it is, let's say hypothetically in the future, it succeeds and it takes off and it scales. That is a feature that directly translates into artists getting more funding. And so if it happens to be a monetization model that Spinamp pursues in the future, it is directly aligned with artists getting more funds themselves. And so it has that aspect of like our success is dependent on and can only exist if we succeed at making artists successful. And when we think about other kinds of monetization models that we may explore, they all will have that kind of quality where it's never the case that Spinamp is taking advantage of content from artists and making money off their backs. It's and it's always the case that actually we're amplifying the potential revenue that artists can make. And of course, there's always the risk, as you say, that traditional streaming platforms and that like having open access to content compromises that, but that's not the case today. We already have like data that shows that it's succeeding as we scale, and I think we have a like kind of responsibility to stay beholden to that and to say that like as long as we scale and grow our product, any monetization scales in a way that artists scale with us, and that essentially we help amplify them rather than them like providing just like something for us to kind of build our own system on top of.
I want to ask you one final question. It's a question that I asked frequently throughout season 4 that I actually think you're the perfect person to ask considering the problem that you're trying to solve. Okay. Every collector is a listener, but not every listener is a collector. How do we turn more listeners into collectors? What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that question is like one of the core motivations behind why we built Spinamp. We wanted to build something that was for listeners, that was for fans, and build it with their experiences and flows in mind first. And so, being a listening app on your phone, being mobile first, and being something that people can integrate into everyday experiences, I think is step one, where we actually get people to like engage with the content and these Web3 systems in a much more like low impact way. When you go and install Spinamp, you just search on the App Store or find it on the website and install it. Immediately you can start using it. You can listen to music. You can see the content. If you start to like tap around and explore a bit more, you'll maybe see, what's this like feed going on? What's this NFT? Why there's numbers here? And so even if you've never heard of Web3 and NFTs, already like we like to think that this is like a way that you can start to get a small introduction to that. I think, and I think that's like the starting point. I think the next is like, how do we start to build features that entice and encourage people to collect and encourage people to set up their wallet and so on, and actually fund things and buy things. I think there's a UX question to that around, okay, how do we just make better wallet UX and so on? How do we make better purchase UX? I think that's something that everyone in Web3 has to deal with, and there's certainly like some solutions to that we could evolve towards. But the harder question is, how do we get existing listeners to see the same value in collecting music NFTs that the collectors do? And I think that comes down to, again, those core underlying values of like, why do people collect, and how can we make those more transparent and clear to like the everyday person when they're browsing Spinamp and coming across an artist, and they like what can they see that actually makes them realize, hey, actually I could support this person and like make a difference to them, and or what can we show them that they can see, like, oh, hey, there's this like interesting subculture and community here, and I want to be a part of this, and like I've got FOMO and I want to join this. And I think creating those kinds of feelings in people through their usage of the app that encourage them and entice them into collecting is the direction that we're going to need to explore in order to make that happen.
Aidan, Godspeed. I'm rooting for you and the Spinamp team. Excited for what you guys are working on. Before I let you go, where can we find you? Where can we learn more?
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks for having me, and lots of fun conversations. I think the best way to find us is on Twitter. We're at spin_amp, or our website, www.spinamp.xyz. And from there, you can see our Twitter, you can see links to our iOS app, our Android app, and our web app, and check them out. The thing that we care about most is people actually using our products. So check out the app, listen to things, see if you find value in consuming Web3 content, and hopefully you become a Spinamp user and start to engage with all the awesome content and artists that we've aggregated.
Amazing. Aidan, thank you so much. Till next time.
Likewise, see ya.